Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, the hours are long, but the pay is low. Rob Miller's memoir of his time at Bloodshot Records. He joins me on the program to discuss the book. Welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. I do appreciate it.
So I want to start with the genesis of this book, because I read in the book that you started this in 2018. So that's pre-pandemic and before the end of Bloodshot. And I had assumed it was either a pandemic project or something coming from the end of Bloodshot. So what happened in 2018 that this book kind of started?
Well, I should say that both of those events ultimately had a great deal of impact on what the book ended up being. But I had started it before that because for years people had been asking me to write something about the label. And a lot of people wanted just maybe sort of a simple history of the label, which struck me as kind of boring and limiting. Because let's face it, most of the world has no idea who we were or what we did. And so it took a while for me to figure out an angle in which to make the book more broadly appealing. And once I found that hook, I started to run with it. And then the pandemic hit. And I had a lot of time to think about the importance of community and all the fragility of underground and indie ecosystems, how quickly they could go away. And then as the things with my unfortunate partner dribbled to their ignominious end, I had to refigure that whole thing as well. So it was quite the process that went through many iterations.
So did those two following events kind of amplify kind of already what was kind of nascent in terms of the story?
Well, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, it certainly did amplify because, in COVID isolation, you really thought about the importance of community. And I will say it also heightened my appreciation for the community that I was no longer able to be a part of and that I was seeing was being lost. And, the book started as it was going to be a much more lighthearted endeavor. It was going to kind of be a how to run an indie label for dummies kind of vibe, and it was going to be a lot more current things that really didn't really apply anymore to the situation. So it became a much more meaningful, I think, book. I would rather have not gone through it all. I'd rather it be a lighter book, but here we are.
You mentioned that you came up with the hook for this book, or kind of like you were struggling to, and then realized kind of what it was. What ultimately was the hook for you?
That my exposure to underground and alternative communities and media outlets when I was a kid, that weird radio station that I found, or that oddball record store, or the diner at the end of the street, that those interactions for me as a teenager informed everything I did with the label, how I ran it, what was important to me, what I kept close to us. I never wanted it to become big. That wasn't really an option most of the time, but it wasn't important to me to be big. But some of those independent labels like SST and Discord, Subterranean and Norton and all these kind of weird independent labels that I was into as a teenager and in college, really it just kind of sunk into my bones how I wanted to run the label, that it was important. Those labels remained important to a lot of people, even if they weren't widely known. And so once I connected my biography to how I ran the label, I was actually doing a lot of self-discovery, going, oh, that's why, like radio stations like yours, like I never forgot about those. Like we always tried to service those stations and the specialty shows, because that's where the community is. If you can stitch together that tapestry of weird advocates all around the country, then you can survive in a business that is predicated on growth.
So the book is on a university press, University of Illinois. How did this end up on an educational imprint?
Are you saying you didn't learn anything?
No, I'm not saying that. It's just like for a rock and roll label memoir / like business breakdown. It doesn't necessarily scream, educational imprint. Like, particularly, when I think there are book imprints that, particularly specialize, like a Jawbone or something, where like that's all they do is like kind of music and bios.
I did have before this really came together. I was in discussions with some bigger presses, but really it came down to my editor, who is a friend of mine for 20 plus years, and she started working at this, and before I even knew that she had changed jobs, she was at a different imprint, and I had in the depths of COVID and during just my absolute darkest personal days of watching everything I worked for being tossed away. I sent her 50, 60, 70,000 words of what I was working on kind of in secret, and asked her if there was any value to it. And she said absolutely. And she just kept working with me. And so out of a sense of absolute loyalty, I stayed with her as she went to this other press and really put a lot of herself into this book and made it a much, much better finished product than it would have been otherwise. So, and if I've learned nothing else over the past several years, it's you find out who your friends are, and she was absolutely a quite possibly a literal lifesaver for me on this. So it was pure loyalty. And they've been doing a great job with promotion though, because they are fans and they believe in it, and they made the book look great. They added in all these full color images, and the design work's been great. So I have no regrets at all about it.
Okay, so coming out of that, I have two questions. One, is an editor kind of like a producer? Like, is there a comp in terms of the roles, like in terms of stewardship of a book versus an album?
Yeah, that's not too far off base. Yeah, I mean, especially if they are committed to it. I mean, she really helped me find the heart of the book. And not even so much as saying, here, do this, but mostly providing opportunities for me to step back in certain areas and go, is this really the way you want to sound? Is this really important? And then in the process of defending it to both her, I would be defending it to myself. And a lot of times, things that I thought were really important to the story, she would point out, are you sure about that? And then I would wrestle with it, and then sometimes just even take it out, and then everything would fall into place. So it's a very collaborative. A good editor, it has to be a very collaborative partnership. And she was free with her admissions that she was wrong. Sometimes she would make me really defend things, which would make me sharpen them, and then she would go, okay, I don't like it, but I'll leave it in there. And several of those things have been mentioned by a lot of the press as things they like. So, it makes you work for things that sometimes maybe you're a little lazy with, when you just throw them in there and maybe you think, oh, that's a funny line. But then when you got to work for it, then it makes it even better.
It does speak to some of the recurrent motif of trusting your gut in terms of, bands that you want to work with, or things that you want to do as a label that it has served you in good stead in the past. And obviously it sounds like it served you in writing this book. I wanted to ask, you mentioned about the University of Illinois Press, doing a good job in terms of the way this book looks and stuff. All of the material, like the posters, the photos and things like that, like, is that something that you had been collecting over the years, or did they help kind of assemble that so that?
No, I was I've always been something of a pack rat. So since I was a kid, shows I would go to, I would keep the flyers or fanzines or postcards or tickets and all that kind of stuff. So they were actually looking for, the book was written, and they were looking for maybe a couple of images to help with the cover, and asked my editor came, said, could I come by your house and take a look at some images and see if we can work on the design? And I brought out all these boxes of things, and her eyes just popped. And and she just was pulling things out of these boxes and says, "This is amazing, this is amazing." And then she went to her bosses, and they pretty quickly agreed to include, I think it's 70, 75 images in there, and it could have easily been, hundreds.
Sure
So
enough.
I do appreciate their willingness and their excitement over seeing that. Yeah.
You mentioned you'd had about 50 or 60,000 words that you shared with her. Up to that point, like, how did you establish like tone and voice when you were writing? Like, is it just like, I'm going to write as if I was telling this story to a person beside me at a bar? Or like, how did you kind of establish what your tone would be?
I don't know that, and that's the great secret of writing. Uh, People have been telling me that they've enjoyed my voice, and it's nothing that I consciously work on. There were parts in the writing where my editor would say that doesn't sound like you, or it sounds like you're getting a little pedantic or preachy or bitter. And those were none of those things were things I wanted to be. So I would look back at it, and once you get a feel for your own rhythm, you can see where you're trying to force other things into it that don't sound like you. So yeah, I don't know. It's some people can write and some can't, I guess. Not to sound cocky or anything, but yeah, I don't know. I didn't think about it, and it was only in the editing process that where you find a way to make that voice consistent, but it's nothing I came up with. The more I hear about comments like yours and things like that, the more I am truly in awe of writers who can write in other people's voices, who, you know, it just seems very hard.
Yeah, you write about yourself being, a bookish, timid to the point of paralysis kid. Like, did you start writing as a kid? Like, were you the type of kid who either wrote a diary or tried to write, fiction or short stories at that point? Or did you kind of come into your own as a storyteller as like an adult and someone, sharing music and trying to proselytize for the stuff you believed in?
I remember distinctly in third or fourth grade, we had to write a story for class, and everyone did just kind of a one-page thing, and I ended up writing a little book, and 20 pages, something like that. And we had to read them in front of the class, and I read mine, and everyone was just busting up laughing. And I thought, well, this is a good way to this is a good way to navigate the world, like cracking people up with little stories that I've told. And uh, yeah, going through high school and college and graduate, I mean, writing has always been on some level pretty easy for me. And so, writing all the press releases for the label, I was able to sharpen our message in a way that I think put us ahead of other labels and maybe made us help us stand out a little bit more from just regular dry business speak. And writing all the website material, or most of it. Um, yeah, but this is the first time I've sat down and really tried to put together something. It's 300 pages, and it was really hard to find that consistent voice. Or, the first couple of drafts, my editor was like, "You made, that joke on page 240. You made that joke on page 70." So, so you really have to. It's such a close reading that is so different than anything I've done before.
You're prone to making the same jokes or anecdotes.
Well, yeah, you're just kind of a throw off one-liner that, oh, I forgot that I wrote that 150 pages ago. Because I did write the book in sections that I would, at least initially, like in 4 or 5 sections, where I would just finish it and put it aside, and then, and I was going through all this legal stuff at the time too. So I would put it down for a month or so because I just couldn't think about it. I couldn't wrap my head around it because I was just consumed with rage at lawyers and lawyering, that I would just forget things that I had put in before. And I'm still, like, when I'm going to these events or readings, or people are reading my words back to me, I'm like, oh yeah, I kind of forgot that that was in there. That's that's a pretty good line.
On the topic of structure, obviously, like you said, you wrote it in chunks. But in terms of the like the breakaway portions of certain chapters and stuff, right? There's kind of these, like printed on grayscale page, kind of like breakout sections in some of the chapters. Is that something you established early on, or was that something that came through editing? That like there's these kind of like pauses or addendums?
Well, that was an ongoing battle with the editor to keep those in. The superstructure of the book was originally built around the idea of what I did is in the isolation of COVID, I went through 25 plus years of interviews and transcripts and online or in print with me, and I realized that I had been over that entire period asked the same handful of questions, and I wanted to explore the resonance of those questions. It didn't matter what position we were in the industry or what album or artist we were putting out at the time. Asked the same questions, and I wasn't able to explore them fully because uh, time constraints. If it's a magazine piece, they have 500 words, whatever. I can't go on long tangents about the intersection of politics and music or where punk and country intersect and all this. I had to come down with short, polished answers of a paragraph or less. This book was an opportunity to take those questions and answer them in long form with all kinds of context and history. But there were a few of those questions, like where did the term insurgent country come from, or where did the name Bloodshot come from, that could be answered in very short tidbits or little sidebars. And I thought it would be fun to just have those rather than shoehorn them into the narrative, have them be little kind of visual breaks in the text. And so if you want, and I have a lot of books like that I really enjoy, that if you just pick it up in the middle and there's a little sidebar, you can read it for 5 minutes and still get a sense of what the book is about or the tone of the book.
It's kind of funny. It reminded me of one sheets. And obviously, like you
Yeah, yeah,
had
that's
a lot
good.
of
I like
experience
that.
writing one sheets where there'd be like kind of some flowery prose about the record or about the creation of the album, and then there'd be that like bullet point stuff and some anecdotes or the recommended if you like. There'd be kind of like that sidebar, and I was curious if like as you said, you had a lot of experience writing those one sheets, whether your brain was kind of wired to like pull information and put the kind of like kernels on the side.
Well, yeah, again, but some of these questions were very easily answerable in just a paragraph or two, and and it seemed a few times because my during the editing process, it was, well, just incorporate these into the text, and I would try and do that, and it just seemed so obvious that that's what I was trying to do that I thought, well, let's just block them off and make them their own little thing. And a lot of the appendices are born out of that as well. Initially, I had those appendices right in the middle of the book, and my editor was just like, "No, this grinds the narrative to a halt." And she was absolutely correct about that, but they were still thematically insular enough that I wanted them to be their own thing. So we hit on the idea of doing the appendices in the back.
So the book isn't just Bloodshot's story; it's your story as well. Did you like? Could you tell this story without kind of your memoir of like how you got to Bloodshot, or like was it important that you lay the groundwork of kind of who you were as to why Bloodshot ended up being what it was?
I think that became very apparent that was necessary. In early drafts, I would talk about business things like why did we do this way, and do a bunch of examples from Justin Townes Earl or Nico Case or something like that. And then I would throw in a little paragraph about how it reminded me of a record store in Detroit growing up that I loved. And my editor would circle that or highlight and go, more of this. And that's how I realized that weaving my biography in and out of the story of the label was the way to humanize it in a way and make it more broadly interesting to people. Because even if you don't know who we are, if you are into independent music or independent literature or any of the underground communities, that you in your lifetime can relate to, again, finding that weird DJ, that late night show that really resonated with you. So it was a way to bring people into the story if they weren't familiar with the label itself. Because we're all fans of weird music, and we're all kind of, everyone's felt that outsiderness to them over their lifetime, and this was a way to tap into that for everyone, because you're reading that and you're like, oh, I don't know this music, but I see a little of myself in that. So as more drafts kept going, I would see how that that record store, its existence, its very existence, and how they held themselves in the community at that time, how that had sunk into me, and how it made it, how it related, how I would run the retail end of the business.
So like the Marty's Records, it was your first job.
Yes.
Yeah.
A little mom and pop, yeah, little street corner, yeah.
The book, as you mentioned, 300 pages, fairly expansive, but as you said, there's revisions and drafts. Was there stuff that you ended up cutting that you wish you hadn't? Like, is there anything that you kind of were like, it was dear to me, but my editor kind of was like, hey, like we need to trim some fat here, and I wish this wasn't as grisly as it was?
Not yet. I haven't found anything yet. Everything that was on the cutting room floor is fine being there, or it can be repurposed for something else. I'm actually working on something else that was in there that got cut fairly early on, because at some point during maybe second COVID summer, I realized that this thing had gotten up around 180,000 words, and I was only about three-quarters of the way through what I wanted to say, and that was just kind of crazy person writing, So I really needed to shave it down. I mean, because this isn't a Ulysses type confessional or anything. I wanted it to be readable, and some things are funny, but they just don't fit the grand narrative of what I wanted to say.
Was there any hesitance about, talking about some of the travails of the label or some of the artists? Like, because I know you at one point referenced like the Sadies kind of having a falling out with Andre Williams on tour in Europe and stuff. Like, was there any, impulse to be protective of the roster and not kind of like explain some of the difficulties that went on?
Oh, I've always had that. Oh, and I feel like I was super protective. There's not a lot of hardly any like salacious or prurient material in there. I mean, I was privy to a lot of dark and inappropriate stuff, or just, bad behavior, but that's really not in there. People getting in fights on the road, or, a few of the things that I do touch on, I touch on them in a way that I felt humanized the endeavor, because it wasn't all happiness and sunshine. There were tough times, but you're not hearing the bad stuff, because I didn't want that to be the focus of it. There's some things in there, but it's not the focus of it. But it to me spoke to the larger puzzle that is keeping a band out there, and just all the little things that musicians and artists have to go through just to get to that stage to perform for us, the lucky music fans, and yeah, I didn't want to go really, big on that kind of stuff, because those kind of tell-all music things strike me as boring. They don't get to the heart of the matter of why we all do this, you know?
Right. It's a byproduct rather than the product, kind of.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you want to go read the Motley Crue book, if you want to read stuff like that, I mean,
So funny. That's the exact one I was thinking of.
so don't, yeah, that's not what this is about. And it's just, before an artist hits the stage, there is 1,000 things they got to deal with that none of us see. And I just wanted to kind of give a little taste of that without going into, oh my God, so and so sleeping with so and has a drug problem and crashed the van or whatever. It's.
Over the years, you wore a lot of different hats at Bloodshot, and before that even, right? Like in terms of working at concerts and radio and things like that. Was there one hat that was most important?
Wow. I guess the hat that knows what is important at that time. I mean, being a production manager and a stage manager and going on the road with bands and being on the other side of it, you got to see every little thing that could go wrong. And you kind of, you had sometimes you had to play psychologist, sometimes you had to play cheerleader, sometimes you just had to be the guy that knows where to get guitar strings at whatever hour of the day. Or so being being aware and being flexible in your tasks, I think is maybe the most important thing, because you could never just settle into being one thing, because then you're missing all these other things that need doing.
So like fluidity and awareness, probably the most apt
Yeah,
kind of.
like don't don't ever think that something can't go wrong.
Uh, you
That's
mentioned
a
that.
that's a really good question, by the way. I really like
Oh,
that.
appreciate that. You mentioned that there was a lot more to this than this, but there is like a significant chunk of appendices, including letters from folks who were fans of the label. What was the decision to include that section?
Because it's hilarious and it's sweet, and it's again, it speaks to that whole idea of community that I think is so easily dismissed and very fragile, and that we're just kind of letting leak away. I mean, think about it. People took time to write us, rather than just blurting out something on a social media post or something. And to me, there's a beauty in that should be celebrated. I was that guy. I was that kid, I was writing labels going, "Hey, I love this," and I think anyone who is dumb enough, or, mulish enough to own their own business, uh, loves that kind of interaction with their fans or their public or a customer, because so often we are just going day to day feeling like, maybe we're just screaming into the void. And then you get this little thing in the mail that someone's out there listening, someone's paying attention. This mattered to somebody. And I just love that. I mean, the letters are hilarious and utterly sincere, I love it.
And receiving one of those is maybe the exact opposite feeling you get when you see the crusher at the record plant.
Yeah, exactly. Because again, so often you're in this office running through spreadsheets. Why didn't this record hit? And then you hear about all these other records that you feel are less good, and they're doing really well, and you wonder what your position is and why are you doing this. And then, and that's been the great thing about the book so far, is I'm hearing so many people are contacting me, telling me their stories about which albums really resonated with them still, or they met their wife at a show, or they moved to a city because they wanted to be closer to this band, and just how, because music meant so much to me, means so much to me, that what we did meant something to other people. I mean, that's what keeps these communities going. I mean, why else do these things?
100%. Well, if you want to read about a curious life in independent music, the hours are long, but the pay is low. Rob Miller's book through the University of Illinois Press. Rob, thanks very much for joining me on the program, and congrats on the release of the book.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. And again, this is all part of the community that keeps independent music going. So thank you for what you do.
My pleasure.